Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back. I think the first time I spoke to this audience was last year, introducing the work of the United Nations Global Compact. My name is Matthias Stausberg, and I'm not going to bore you with the mundane details, organizational details of our work, but I'm going to get right into it. I want to talk about the case for sustainability today. Now, sustainability has become sort of the buzzword of our age. We use it all the time, we hear it everywhere. In all sorts of contexts, things are sustainable, things are unsustainable. You hear people talk about sustainability saying things like, dude, the way you're eating is just not sustainable, for example. Or, I just met this girl and we started dating, but the way things are going, I don't think the relationship is sustainable. That's not the kind of sustainability, of course, that we here at the UN talk about. We talk about sustainable development, and in the context of the Global Compact, we talk about corporate sustainability. And what that means in our definition is we talk about aligning corporate strategies and operations with universal values, ideally the values of the United Nations. But so we hear about sustainability all the time, and I want to drill a little deeper into the meaning of the term. What does it actually mean? Where does it come from? And some of you may know this. Some of you that have studied economics or development studies or other fields may have learned this at some point. Sustainability actually has its origin in forestry management, going back all the way to the 19th century to Germany. And of course, forests being very, very delicate systems in a way, especially when you're talking about wood as a natural resource. You can't just cut down an entire forest and then you have to wait 20 years for the next trees to grow and provide more wood. So forest management early on was faced with this challenge to manage the natural resource wood, a very slow-growing resource, in a way that would allow or would generate steady crop yields over the years. So a steady supply of wood that would be available every year. And that's how the term sustainability actually emerged. And then over time, of course, as with many of these buzzwords and fashionable terms, it was expanded. And starting at the very latest in the 1970s and 80s, people started talking about sustainable development. And what was sort of a watershed moment was a report that was produced in 1987 by the UN, by a UN commission headed by the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Brundtland Report. And it came up with a definition of sustainable development. And that definition went like this: meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's very much still the definition that we all work with, that we all try to live by, and that we try to apply to different aspects of our work. And in the case of the United Nations Global Compact, we try to apply that to our work with corporations. Now, how does this all apply to corporations and the way businesses operate? Early on, beginning in the 1980s and 90s, a lot of people started thinking about the way corporations are impacting not only the environment, but also the ways in which they're impacting societies. And as we first started talking about the phenomenon of globalization, people started also talking about negative impacts of globalization. And then in the 1990s, there were a lot of corporate scandals that triggered the emergence of what we know now as the anti-globalization movement. And people started to take a closer look at corporate strategies and operations. And I'm choosing the example of a pair of jeans because it's a good one and a very illustrative one. Because a pair of jeans can really tell us a lot of stories about corporate sustainability. Why is that? Well, let's have a closer look. A pair of jeans is a complex product. It begins with raw materials, in this case, cotton. And that cotton comes from somewhere, from the US, from India, from China. Those are the 3 top cotton producers in the world, and then a handful of other countries. And you can ask a lot of questions just about the growing process. What is the environmental impact? What kind of pesticides are used? How does this affect local communities? How are workers treated that pick cotton in the field? And so on and so forth. Then we look at the fabric mills, and we look at the way the cotton is eventually spun into, or the raw cotton as a raw material is spun into cotton as a fabric. And that's a classic case of corporate sustainability or corporate unsustainability, the textile industry, and the way workers are treated, for example. That was an early focus of anti-corporate activists, of social activists looking into working conditions in textile factories around the world. It's what triggered a lot of anti-corporate protests in the 1990s. You can look at manufacturing, the way then that the fabric is used to produce a pair of jeans. And it's very much, it plays out along the same lines. You have environmental impacts and you have social impacts along the way. Transport and distribution, it's a big issue nowadays because as we talk about climate change, it's sort of moved in the spotlight, and we know that a lot of products actually generate the plurality, or the majority of their climate footprint or their water use footprint in the transportation and distribution process. And there's much debate, for example, about food miles, much controversial debate, meaning the climate impact, the amount of miles, the number of miles that a particular product travels. Do we have to import everything from overseas? What is the impact of that? And so on and so forth. The consumer, the role that you and I play in the use of a product, which is a significant factor, and I will tell you in a second why. And finally, the end of the cycle and what we do with the product once we no longer use it. In the case of a pair of jeans, most of us will throw it away. Perhaps if it's still okay, we may pass it on to someone else, give it to a second-hand store, who knows what. But very few of us actually recycle these products, and very few companies offer the opportunity to recycle these products, although some do now. And it's interesting because companies are beginning to engage in what they call life cycle assessments of these products. So they look at each of these steps, and they try to come to terms with the environmental and social impact. They try to determine what the carbon emissions are. They try to determine what the water use is. They try to determine what the social impact is in the communities on the ground. And interestingly, in the case of a pair of jeans, and that's a fascinating aspect, Levi Strauss, who did a lot of work, and to their credit, much of this life cycle analysis, much of these details come from their work. They figured out, for example, that most of the water, or most of the energy that is used in the life cycle of a pair of jeans is actually used by the end consumer. Why? Because we wash a pair of jeans, we dry a pair of jeans. In the average life cycle, a pair of jeans is washed about 32 times and consequently dried 32 times. So they found out that up to 50% of a pair of jeans' climate footprint can be reduced by line drying a pair of jeans and washing it cold. It just gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, I'm just going to, because time is limited, I'm just going to throw a few things at you that I think are noteworthy about the corporate sustainability movement and why we're engaging in these discussions and why we're trying to work with corporations to become more responsible, to become more efficient, to minimize negative environmental and social impacts. Some of you have been following the US election cycles, and there was a moment a couple of weeks ago, I believe, in Iowa when Mitt Romney was speaking at a rally, and someone heckled him, said something about corporations, and Romney responded, said, "Corporations are people, my friend." Of course, he was referring to the Citizens United case and the question of whether or not corporations have the right to free speech, as the US Supreme Court affirmed. Now, another way to look at it is corporations are countries, my friends. And that's an interesting notion, actually, because it gives us an idea of how much we can actually move and change if we work with corporations and get corporations to be more responsible citizens. And it gives us also an idea of how much damage we can do if we don't. Here's a few interesting statistics. Look at Norway, okay? One of the most developed countries in the world. In 2010 had a product of round about 413 billion US dollars. Very wealthy country, okay? Look at Walmart. Walmart, the world's largest one of the world's largest corporations, in 2010 had revenues of round about $422 billion. Now, economists in the room will throw up their arms in exasperation and will say, how can you compare GDP to revenues? Those are apples and oranges, and that is true, but it's still, in terms of relative wealth or well-being of a country versus a corporation, it's still a very illustrative measure. So it gives you an idea of where we stand in terms of corporate power to change things or corporate power to potentially do damage. Another example, Thailand, 2010 GDP, $319 billion. ExxonMobil, 2010 revenues, roughly $290 billion. If you were to compile a table based on 2010 figures, juxtaposing countries and corporations, 42 of the world's largest 100 economies would be corporations. Now, there are challenges and there are opportunities, and the question is really which way the pendulum swings. Let me just throw a few things at you that we at the United Nations are concerned about and are trying to address and have been trying to address because they really get to the core of what sustainable development is all about. Nearly 1 billion people around the world still have no access to safe drinking water. 2.6 billion people live without access to proper sanitation. And 12% of the global population use 85% of the freshwater resources or the drinking water resources. That's a stunning, stunning figure. And of course, we have to point the finger at ourselves living here, the US, other places around the world. I think the highest water usage is in the Gulf states. It is really a very illustrative of how we're wasting precious resources. And water is a precious resource. Much different on the energy side. 1.6 billion people have no access to electricity. It is one of the reasons why the Secretary General launched an initiative last year that is going into full force this year, Sustainable Energy for All, with a goal to increase energy efficiency, double the use or the mix or the share of renewables in the global energy mix, and improve or create universal energy access because of these 1.6 billion people that still don't have access to any kind of energy source. And there's so much that comes with this because it's not just about not having access to electricity. It's about education. It's about women's empowerment. It's about economic opportunities. Because imagine if you have the power to power a cell phone somewhere in a rural area where no landlines exist, that cell phone can be the difference of having to walk to a market 10 miles in the morning to figure out whether or not your products will be in demand. It means the difference of having a light at night enables you to study instead of a candle. It is the difference of having a kerosene heater that is dangerous, kills more people, indoor cooking and indoor fumes kill more people per year around the world than malaria does. So those are significant ramifications. And finally, more than 1 billion people worldwide live on less than $1 per day, and 25% of children under 5 years in the developing world are malnourished. So the question then is for business leaders, is this a challenge or is it an opportunity? We say it's both. It's a challenge if you as a business do not learn, do not know how to minimize environmental and social risks, because increasingly you will be punished if you don't. But it is also an opportunity if you manage to capitalize on some of these needs, if you develop products and services that cater to the world's poorest, that seek to address global challenges. And there are plenty of examples of what corporations are doing to do that. And there are certain drivers that help us make the case. Markets, of course, financial analysts, financial markets, investors that are increasingly willing to reward good corporate practice. Regulators that are increasingly looking at environmental and social performance of corporations. And then people like you and me, consumers. Because at the end of the day, we move markets with the power of the purse, with the preferences and choices that we make. And I want to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure there will be some questions later.